Ancient Egypt loved to carve its triumphs into stone, the victories of pharaohs, the blessings of the gods, and the rituals that kept the kingdom alive. But there were parts of Egyptian life that were never meant to be spoken, let alone remembered. And nothing was buried deeper than the truth about the young women chosen as temple virgins. They were selected in childhood, taken from ordinary homes and placed inside holy walls where silence echoed louder than prayers. Outsiders imagined a life of honor, of purity, of living close to the gods. But inside the sanctuaries, the rules of purity were absolute. A single mistake, a single accusation, could destroy everything they were allowed to be. Before I continue deeper into this hidden world, let me know in the comments where in the world you are watching this from. Your support helps bring these forgotten stories back to life. For the temple virgins, every sunrise belonged to the priesthood. Their bodies, their thoughts, their movements, everything was regulated by strict spiritual laws that few today truly understand. They woke before dawn, washed in cold ritual water, and entered chambers sealed from the outside world. They weren't simply servants. They were symbols, living offerings meant to embody purity in its most rigid form. The priests described them as daughters of the gods, but in reality, they lived more like prisoners of perfection. A whisper, even an unfounded rumor, could become a spiritual verdict. A misstep during ritual, a moment of hesitation, a failure to recite a prayer flawlessly. All of it could be recorded as impurity in the temple as private scrolls. And once written, those accusations rarely vanished. The priesthood held immense power. More than most people realize. They didn't just speak for the gods, they controlled the rituals that defined Egyptian society. They supervised food, offerings, ceremonies, the calendar, even the interpretation of omens. And over the temple virgins, their authority was absolute. A young girl entering the sanctuary didn't simply join her religious order, she surrendered her freedom. Inside the inner chambers, the air smelled of incense and oil. The walls were painted with scenes of gods judging souls, weighing hearts, punishing sin. These images weren't just religious artwork. They were warnings. Every virgin lived with the constant fear that a priest could declare her spiritually tainted, unworthy, or disobedient. And when that happened, the consequences weren't light. Egyptians didn't leave records of the harshest punishments, not openly, but fragments from later historians, hidden papyri, and temple laws hint at a system built on fear, shame, ritual confinement, and punishments meant to cleanse impurity rather than simply correct behavior. Some virgins were isolated for days in dark sanctuaries, instructed to pray until their voices cracked. Others were assigned grueling ritual cleaning tasks, meant to symbolize purification, but in reality breaking their strength and spirit. Some were removed from the temple entirely, a fate seen as worse than death, because it meant they had failed the gods themselves. The outside world viewed temple virgins as holy. Inside, many lived with constant dread. Even innocence wasn't enough to protect them. All it took was a single priest's disapproval, a suspicious glance, a perceived mistake during ceremony, and a girl's life could be rewritten forever. And there was one punishment whispered about in surviving texts, a punishment so devastating that scribes refused to describe it in detail. Only hints remain, references to severe purification, forced rituals meant to strip a woman of her status, or acts meant to make an example of her to the rest of the priesthood. One papyrus fragment mentions a virgin who lost her place among the living spirits after breaking her vow. Another mentions a girl returned to dust in the chamber of judgment. The tomb inscriptions avoid specifics, but the tone is unmistakable. Whatever happened in those chambers was meant to terrify, to control, and to ensure obedience. The priests believed they were defending purity, but purity enforced through fear becomes something else entirely, something darker, something few would dare question. Temple virgins were taught that purity brought them closer to the gods, but with every ritual, every demand, every correction, they learned a harsher truth. The gods were not the ones they had to fear. The real threat came from the men who claimed to speak on their behalf, The stories that survive today come from fragments, from accounts written in margins, from foreign historians, from whispers carried across centuries, and each one reveals the same chilling pattern. The priesthood wielded its power with an iron grip, and the virgins, chosen for holiness, lived under the constant shadow of punishment, humiliation, and control. One of the oldest surviving temple texts even warns priests to watch the daughters of purity closely, as if they were not symbols of holiness, but constant risks that needed restraint. This mindset shaped everything: rituals, punishments, and the unspoken enforcement that ensured obedience for some virgins. This life of relentless surveillance broke them in silence. Others tried to escape their duties, only to face consequences far harsher than the mistakes they committed. And a rare few were accused of violating purity vows, an accusation that carried the most terrifying punishment of all. What the priests believed they were preserving was spiritual order, but what they were really creating was fear so deep it shaped the rest of a girl's life. And the worst part, nearly every trace of these punishments was erased. Egypt wanted to be remembered for its beauty, not its brutality. What happened in the temple stayed in the shadows until now. There is a reason these stories survive only in pieces, and what those fragments reveal is far darker than anything carved into stone. The deeper you go into the history of temple life, the more one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The priesthood was not just a religious order. It was a machine of control, and the temple virgins lived at the very center of it, watched, judged, and disciplined in ways that never appeared in public inscriptions. The most feared accusation a temple virgin could ever face was a single phrase carved into the private scrolls: "She has broken purity." It didn't matter if it was true. It didn't matter if it was a misunderstanding. Once those words were spoken by a priest, the girl's world collapsed. Purity wasn't simply a moral concept in ancient Egypt. It was a state of existence. A temple virgin accused of impurity wasn't just seen as unclean. She was believed to be spiritually poisonous. Her presence alone was considered dangerous to the gods, and so the priests responded with punishments designed not just to condemn, but to erase. The first step was isolation. A girl accused of impurity was taken to a secluded chamber deep inside the temple, a room most Egyptians never knew existed. It was cold, windowless, and silent except for the endless echo of her own breathing. The priests called it the Chamber of Reflection, but the girls who entered it knew its real purpose: to break the mind before anything else. Some spent hours inside, others days. Alone in the dark, they waited for the sound of approaching sandals, the priests returning to decide their fate. Every footstep in the hallway became a moment of terror. Every whisper outside the door, a possible sentence. The next punishment was ritual humiliation. Egyptian religion revolved around symbolism, and the priests used symbolism as a weapon. A girl accused of impurity was stripped of her ceremonial jewelry, anklets, bracelets, the beads that marked her rank, each piece taken away like fragments of her identity. To lose these ornaments wasn't just dishonor. It meant she was no longer recognized by the god she had served. Then came the purification rites. The temple texts described them with poetic language, but the reality behind those phrases was harsh. The priests believed the body could be cleansed through ritual strain, exhausting tasks meant to purify the spirit through suffering. Some girls were forced to carry heavy jars of sacred water endlessly across the temple courtyard. Others were made to scrub floors, pillars, or altars until their hands trembled. The point was never the task itself. It was obedience, submission, proof that she still feared the priesthood more than she feared the gods. But there was a final punishment, the punishment so severe that scribes refused to write its full details. Only fragments remain, but together they reveal something terrifying. It was known only as the severing. The surviving texts never describe it directly. Instead, they speak of girls who were removed from the service of the gods, or set outside the circle of purity, or whose names were no longer spoken inside the sacred halls. Ancient Egyptian culture believed that memory was a form of life. To have your name erased was to die twice, once in the flesh and again in eternity. Temple virgins who received this punishment were never mentioned again. Their names vanished from records. Their roles were reassigned. Their lives beyond the temple, if they continued at all, became shadows in history. Some historians believe the severing meant exile. Others believe it meant punishment carried out in secret rituals. And some argue it symbolized social death. The idea that a girl who failed her vow was spiritually cut off from everything she once was. What is undeniable is this: the priesthood made sure that no one ever forgot what happened to a virgin who defied them. They didn't need public trials. They didn't need written laws. The fear alone was enough to shape obedience, and that fear was passed down from girl to girl, generation after generation, until the temple system itself collapsed centuries later. By then, the truth had already been buried beneath sand and silence. The temples of Egypt still stand today, beautiful, towering, carved with stories of gods and kings. But the stories of the temple virgins, the hidden punishments, the broken vows, and the rituals of control, those remain in the shadows, not because they were unimportant, but because the priests never wanted the world to know how much power they once held over the innocent. This story isn't just about ancient religion. It's about what happens when purity becomes a weapon, when faith becomes a cage, when those who claim to protect the sacred become the very force that destroys it. If you want more untold stories like this, the hidden punishments, the forgotten rituals, the darker corners of ancient history that textbooks leave out, make sure you follow, share, and support the channel. Your engagement helps bring these buried truths back to the surface. And tell me in the comments, which ancient civilization's hidden history should I uncover next?